The first morning I scrubbed their marble floor on my knees, I understood exactly how invisible I had become. Shoes passed inches from my face. Laughter echoed above me. Orders were thrown casually, as if I were part of the furniture. No one bothered to learn my name. To them, I was just the new maid who should work faster and speak less. What they did not know was that every insult landed on someone who owned the building they were standing in. I had taken this job quietly, deliberately. No makeup. Plain clothes. Head down. I listened more than I spoke. They complained freely in front of me, assuming I was harmless. They talked about promotions, power, and the future of the company with careless arrogance. They joked about how easy it was to control people who needed money. I cleaned their offices, served their coffee, and memorized everything. The woman who snapped her fingers at me during meetings had once blocked my proposal without reading it. The man who criticized my work ethic now tossed his trash at my feet. They had no idea that weeks earlier, the board had signed papers placing the entire company under my leadership. My appointment was confidential until the annual announcement. I was not hiding. I was observing. Every night, after they left, I returned to my real work. Contracts. Strategy. Decisions that would determine their careers. By day, I wiped desks they believed defined their importance. By night, I decided which of those desks would still be occupied. They thought power was loud. I knew better. As I mopped the hallway outside the executive office, I overheard my name for the first time. Not spoken with respect, but with ridicule. They laughed about the new CEO arriving soon and how easily they would manipulate her. I smiled quietly to myself, because the woman they underestimated was already there. By the end of the first week, my hands were raw and my patience was sharpened to a fine edge. They treated me like background noise, issuing commands without eye contact, assuming obedience was my only skill. I let them believe it. Every demand they made revealed more about who they truly were when they thought no one important was watching. I learned their routines quickly. Who arrived early and pretended to work. Who stayed late only when executives were present. Who took credit for ideas they did not create. They spoke freely in front of me, convinced that someone wearing an apron could not possibly understand strategy or numbers. During lunch breaks, I sat alone in the service corridor, eating quietly while scrolling through reports on my phone. Market shifts. Internal performance reviews. Notes from the board. The same people who dismissed me as a maid were already under evaluation by me. They just did not know it yet. One afternoon, I was sent to clean the executive conference room before an important meeting. As I wiped fingerprints from the glass table, I recognized the agenda left behind. It outlined a restructuring plan I personally designed months ago. They were about to discuss my work without knowing I was the one who created it. I stayed in the room longer than necessary, listening as they filed in. They criticized the plan, called it unrealistic, and mocked the intelligence of whoever wrote it. One manager laughed and said the new CEO would fail within 6 months. Others agreed confidently. I kept my head down and continued cleaning, storing every word. Later that evening, I received a secure message confirming the official announcement date. 2 weeks away. Everything until then was a test. Not of them, but of me. How much I could endure. How much truth I needed before making decisions. As I left the building that night, exhaustion weighed on my body, but clarity settled in my mind. They believed they were powerful because they could command someone like me. Soon, they would learn what real power felt like, and it would not ask permission. The second week began with tension I could feel in the air. Whispers traveled faster. Deadlines tightened. Everyone sensed that something was coming, even if they could not name it. I continued moving silently through hallways, carts squeaking, mop in hand, absorbing every detail they never bothered to hide. One morning, a senior manager snapped at me for cleaning too slowly near his office. He reminded me that people like me were replaceable. I apologized and stepped aside, lowering my gaze. Inside, I noted his name, his department, and the declining numbers I had reviewed the night before. Replaceable was a word he would soon understand. That afternoon, I overheard a private conversation that changed everything. 2 executives spoke carelessly near the break room, discussing layoffs. Not based on performance, but loyalty. They planned to protect each other while sacrificing entire teams beneath them. The cruelty of it settled heavily in my chest. I finished my shift with steady hands, then went home and opened my laptop. I reviewed the same departments they laughed about cutting. Dedicated employees. Strong results. Poor leadership. The contrast was undeniable. The decision I had been delaying suddenly became clear. The next day, an email circulated requesting updated reports from every division. Panic followed. Managers scrambled. Coffee cups shook. Voices rose. They assumed the board was watching more closely than before. They were right, just not in the way they imagined. I was cleaning the lobby when a junior analyst accidentally dropped a folder at my feet. Papers spilled everywhere. She apologized repeatedly, embarrassed. I helped her gather them, offering a quiet smile. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment, she saw something unexpected. Not pity. Understanding. That night, I finalized a list. Promotions. Transfers. Terminations. Not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. The company deserved leadership that respected people, not exploited them. As I shut down my computer, I realized something important. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. The announcement was only days away, and when the truth surfaced, it would not just shock them. It would redefine everything they thought they knew about power. The building felt different as the announcement day approached. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Not because they suspected me, but because fear had begun to replace confidence. Emails from the board increased. Meetings were rescheduled. Performance reviews were suddenly treated as urgent matters. I continued my routine without change. Floors cleaned. Trash emptied. Coffee served. The more ordinary I appeared, the more invisible I became. And invisibility was my greatest advantage. One afternoon, I was assigned to the executive floor, a place usually restricted and heavily guarded. The irony was sharp. I had full access without anyone questioning it, simply because I wore a uniform they associated with obedience. I moved freely, wiping desks that cost more than my monthly paycheck. On one of them, I noticed an open laptop displaying a presentation draft for the upcoming announcement. They were speculating about the new CEO. Slides filled with guesses, assumptions, and jokes. One slide listed potential candidates, all of them wrong. They had narrowed power down to familiar faces, convinced leadership must look like them. I memorized every name. Later that day, I overheard a manager bragging about how he trained his staff to fear him. He believed intimidation was efficiency. His laughter echoed in the hallway as I passed with my cart. He never noticed the board member who overheard him from behind a glass wall. That evening, I received confirmation from the board chair. Final preparations were complete. The reveal would happen in the main conference hall. Attendance mandatory. No exceptions. As I left work, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. Plain clothes. Tired eyes. A posture shaped by long days. Anyone looking would see a maid heading home. No one would see the woman about to decide their future. At home, I laid out a suit I had not worn in months. Clean. Sharp. Waiting. I did not feel nervous. I felt ready. Because the moment they stopped seeing me as human was the moment they surrendered their power, and they had no idea how close that moment was. The morning of the announcement arrived heavier than the others. The building buzzed with forced smiles and quiet desperation. People dressed sharper than usual, voices polished, attitudes suddenly respectful. Everyone wanted to be seen. Everyone wanted to survive what they sensed was coming. I arrived early, in uniform, pushing my cart through the lobby as if it were any other day. The security team nodded at me without a second glance. That alone revealed how deeply they underestimated anyone they believed was beneath them. I moved through the halls slowly, taking in faces that would soon change forever. I in the executive wing, tension was sharp enough to cut. Managers rehearsed speeches under their breath. Assistants whispered about potential shakeups. A few people laughed too loudly, trying to mask fear. I served coffee in the boardroom while they argued about strategy, unaware that the final strategy had already been approved. One executive complained openly about the staff, saying loyalty was a myth and fear was cheaper. Another agreed and added that workers were tools, nothing more. I stood beside the table, refilling cups, listening carefully. Every word they spoke sealed their fate further. Just before the meeting, an assistant rushed past me, dropping a tablet. The screen lit up with confidential notes addressed directly to me as CEO. She grabbed it quickly, embarrassed, never noticing my calm expression. The irony almost made me smile. When the announcement time drew closer, I was instructed to leave the conference floor. I obeyed, pushing my cart into the service corridor. There, I stopped. I changed out of the uniform slowly, deliberately. Each movement felt symbolic, like shedding a lie I had carried long enough. The suit fit perfectly. The woman staring back at me in the mirror looked nothing like the maid they dismissed. She looked like authority. As I walked toward the main hall, no one recognized me at first. Then heads began to turn. Confusion spread. Whispers followed. Some faces drained of color as realization started to dawn. The doors to the conference hall opened, and with every step forward, the balance of power shifted. They were about to learn the cost of humiliation. The room fell into a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. Conversations stopped mid-breath. Faces that had ignored me for weeks now stared openly, trying to connect the image of the maid with the woman standing before them in a tailored suit. Confusion rippled across the room, followed by disbelief. I walked to the front without rushing. Every step felt earned. I could feel their eyes tracking me, searching for answers, hoping this was some kind of mistake. The board members were already seated. Their calm expressions confirmed everything. The board chair stood and announced the appointment. My name echoed through the hall like a final verdict. A few people gasped. Others froze. Some lowered their heads immediately, understanding the consequences before they were spoken. I turned to face them fully. The same people who had ordered me around now avoided eye contact. The senior manager who called me replaceable looked as if the floor might open beneath him. The woman who snapped her fingers at me clutched her notebook with shaking hands. I began speaking, my voice steady and clear. I thanked the staff for their hard work and resilience, especially those whose efforts often went unnoticed. A few junior employees straightened in their seats, surprised. Then I shifted to leadership. I addressed performance, accountability, culture. I spoke about respect as a non-negotiable value, not a favor granted by position. With every sentence, tension tightened. They knew what was coming. Screens behind me lit up with data. Missed targets. Inflated reports. Abuse complaints buried and ignored. Patterns of behavior that could no longer be excused. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When I paused, the silence returned, thicker than before. This was not revenge fueled by anger. This was consequence delivered with precision, and I was just getting started. The room shifted from shock to fear as names began to appear on the screen behind me. Each slide carried weight. Each number told a story they had tried to hide. I watched their reactions carefully, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This was the moment where truth stripped away titles. I announced immediate changes. Departments would be restructured. Leadership roles reassigned. Some positions dissolved entirely. I spoke slowly, allowing the reality to settle in. The executives who once laughed at my work now sat frozen, calculating their losses in real time. One by one, managers were asked to remain after the meeting. The rest were dismissed. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood, stunned, whispering as they exited. The hallway filled with nervous energy. Those left behind knew what that meant. I addressed them directly. I reminded them that authority was not proven by fear or humiliation, but by integrity and results. The same individuals who dismissed me as invisible now struggled to meet my gaze. Their silence was louder than any apology. Security waited discreetly near the doors. Files were prepared. Decisions finalized long before this moment. There would be no negotiations. No excuses. Leadership required accountability, and accountability had arrived. As the meeting ended, I stepped aside and let the process unfold. Some tried to speak to me privately. Others avoided me entirely. The contrast was striking. Weeks ago, they could not be bothered to acknowledge my presence. Now, they were desperate to be seen. Later that afternoon, I walked through the building again. This time, people stood when I entered. They greeted me with respect, some with relief. The junior analyst I had helped earlier smiled at me, eyes bright with hope. That mattered more than any promotion, but the story was not over yet. Because the hardest lesson was still coming for those who believed power made them untouchable. The final wave came quietly, without drama, and that was what made it devastating. Formal notices were delivered. Access cards were deactivated. Offices once guarded by arrogance were cleared in silence. The people who built their confidence on belittling others now faced the reality of empty desks and unanswered calls. I did not celebrate. I observed. Power did not need applause. In the days that followed, the culture of the company began to shift. Meetings changed tone. Voices softened. People listened. Employees who had been ignored for years were finally heard. Talent that had been buried under fear began to rise. One afternoon, I walked past the service corridor where I once ate my lunch alone. It looked smaller now, less significant. Not because it had changed, but because I had. That space reminded me why I led the way I did. Humiliation teaches lessons success never could. I addressed the entire company in a final message. I spoke about dignity, opportunity, and the responsibility that came with leadership. I made it clear that no role defined a person's worth. Work did not measure value. Character did. Some of those who had hurt me tried to reach out later. Apologies arrived carefully worded, heavy with regret. I acknowledged none of them. Closure did not require forgiveness, only growth. The empire they underestimated was not built on revenge. It was built on patience, observation, and the refusal to become what once tried to break me. They made me work as their maid, believing I was powerless. What they never understood was that I was learning exactly who deserved power, and when the truth finally stood in front of them, there was nothing left to say.